Over the last year, I have talked in person with more than 500 podcasters. In the last 2.5 years, I have also analyzed more than 1,300 podcasts personally. And my agency, GHA Marketing, manages, grows, and monetizes at all time more than 40 podcasts. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I would grow and multiply by at least 3 the number of views that the podcast Entrepreneurs on Fire by Johnny Dumas could have. Now, a small disclaimer, very rapid. I've interviewed John. He's an amazing guy, and clearly he's doing something very well with his podcast because he's making a lot of money with it, and he has a top-ranking podcast in the entrepreneurship. However, there are still some small things that I think he could potentially do better to have like a much bigger impact, and this is exactly what I want to highlight in the video. Also, the purpose of this video is to show you how we typically analyze a podcast to help them grow and to monetize further. Let's get on with the show. All right, so an analysis that we do for podcasters typically look like this. So we analyze every aspect of the podcast, starting with the main objectives. We want to make sure that we understand properly what is it that the podcaster is trying to achieve with his or her podcast. So here for John, it's pretty straightforward, and he highlighted it in the interview I did with him. He wants to educate and inspire listeners with in-depth interviews from inspiring entrepreneurs, so other entrepreneurs on fire can replicate, do the same, and get the same success. And the business model behind the podcast is super transparent. In the case of John, it's like mainly podcast sponsorship. Also, there are lots of Entrepreneurs on Fire resources. There is a bit of affiliate marketing and so on and so forth. But actually, you can just go and check it out on his website directly. He reports and is super transparent on all this information each and every month. And you can see the split. So in the last reported month, which was November 2024, he made almost $100,000 split as follow. Now, there is one small thing about John's podcast is that to appear on the show, because there is so much demand, there is now a fee of $3,500 if the episode is published. So that's something that you need to bear in mind. Not every podcast can do that, but you can definitely potentially have sponsors if you have a very specific niche. So here the whole idea of John is that there is a big sponsor, which is HubSpot, and then every entrepreneur coming on the show and being published has to pay a $3,500 appearance fee. Again, that's totally transparent and public. This is information that you can find on the website if you apply to be a guest on the show. So that's the business model. And so here it's pretty straightforward, right? The bigger the audience, well, the more people John helps, first of all, and inspires, right? The more entrepreneurs get to get amazing insights from the top entrepreneurs in this world. But also a bigger audience means bigger reach, bigger credibility, more listeners, more sponsorships, bigger sponsorship deals as well, more customers for his resources in this case. So we always have a little touch around guests. John releases an episode every day, literally. So it's hard to do more episodes. You could do 2 a day, but then it starts to be a lot of work. So the whole idea here is to say, hey, the bigger the audience, the bigger the reach of the podcast, the more sponsorship revenues and the higher the production and appearance fee can be. That's pretty much in a nutshell the business model of John, which is what we look at in the first place to be able to say, okay, then this is what you need to do with your podcast. Then we have a look at quality. And so here, in our experience, a top-ranking podcast, a top-performing podcast, whatever the success criteria, has a super high level of quality. Here we highlight audio, obviously, but there is also content and video quality, which are super important. So in the case of John, the content is obviously absolutely amazing. He wouldn't get such level of success if it wasn't the case. Now, something that we typically do when we start working with podcasters who don't really know how to get compounding traction organically with the podcast is we look at tools like Google Trends, Google Keywords Planner, social media trends, Reddit communities, Quora questions. The whole idea is to say, okay, what is it that your ideal listener, your ideal client, if you have a business behind it, is currently looking for on internet? Because most of you guys who have a podcast, you know exactly your industry and you know the most common questions, right? But what is it that people are actually looking for right now on internet that we can maybe position the content on to make sure that we maximize the reach and build authority in front of the right people. So that's an exercise that we do. In the case of John, so he is getting guests who pay to be on the podcast, and then obviously the episode is crafted around the expertise of the guest. So there is not really this work of like, okay, what is it that my audience wants to listen to? But any topic related to entrepreneurship, obviously, and how to be a better entrepreneur and how to know better success is going to be relevant for his audience. Plus, his audience is pretty well established right now. So there is not a super important need to follow exactly what the audience wants. Plus, at the size that John has reached, you can definitely imagine that he gets the feedback from the audience and try to incorporate this in the show. Audio quality wise, obviously amazing, especially on the host side, like that's literally his main job. So it better be good quality, and it is. And on the guest side as well, obviously we see that there is a real preparation work that is done here and a real filtering process in terms of, okay, who comes on the show. This isn't always the case though. There are lots of podcasts that we analyze that still have a bit of a crappy audio, especially on the guest side. That's every podcaster's problem, right? You usually have a proper, decent setup, but when it comes to your guests, they are usually doing with whatever they have, right? Sometimes it's going to be earphones, which can be okay, depending on the brand. Sometimes it's going to be even the microphone of the laptop, which starts to be problematic. If that's your case and you're sometimes struggling with the guest audio quality, you can go on podcast.adobe.com/enhance, which is a fantastic tool where you can just upload a file, an audio file, and enhance it from 0 to 100%. So you need to manage and make sure that it's not going to sound too robotic, too AI, but it's definitely getting you a much better, clearer, crisper audio than you input, especially if you have poor audio quality. Go and check it out, test it. I'm going to put the link in the description because this is just an absolutely amazing tool. And last but not least, video quality. So in the case of John Lee Dumas, and that's something that we've talked a bit, him and I, is like he is not present on YouTube. I mean, he is present on YouTube, but he is not recording with video the episodes and publishing the video version of those episodes. And for me here, there is a huge opportunity for John. Why? Because if you look at a certain studies, so I'm writing an ebook about podcasts, obviously, and we've looked at studies around what platform do people go to listen and consume podcasts? And YouTube is one that is not reflected in the RSS feed, so in the podcast hosting platforms that podcasters typically use because it's not connected, but YouTube extracts and like copies the RSS feed of podcasters and just publish on YouTube and YouTube Music. So, but they do not feed back the data to the different podcast platforms. However, if we look at stats, so there is a survey that came out at the beginning of 2023. So it's 2 years ago now, because I'm recording this in January 2025. And already back then, 17th of January 2023, already back then, a survey asked US listeners which platform they preferred for listening to podcasts. And YouTube came out on top at 33%. Spotify 24% and Apple Podcasts 12%. I'm going to get back to those two stats a little bit later on. But so YouTube already in January 2023 was dominant. And then there is a study that came out in Q3 of 2023, so a few months later. And here it validated that. And depending on the provider of the study that we are looking at, so here there is Signal Hill Insights and Triton Digital Podcast Metrics Demos Plus. So here again, YouTube came out on top, and depending on which one we are looking at, YouTube consolidates more downloads than Spotify and Apple Podcasts together. So even if that might not be always the case, right? YouTube is clearly number one, so we cannot overlook it anymore. And we are just talking about listeners here. Imagine the number of people who are watching podcasts now, which is really, really huge. Why do you think Spotify is actually pushing for the video to be published on their platform as well? They are proposing video podcasts to all their audience now. And they are saying that a lot of people actually consume podcasts in a video manner. So video, especially in 2025 and forward, is not an option anymore if you really want to grow your podcast and reach a new audience. So in the case of John, I mean, you can see the business report as well, right? He's not doing too bad for himself with the podcast. But when you see this type of figures, you can imagine that it could actually be double the amount of money that he could be making if he was properly getting an audience on YouTube, because clearly the views, the few dozen views that he's getting per episode on YouTube are not making up for whatever he's getting on podcast platforms, because he's at 170 million downloads lifetime right now. So this is clearly not anything comparable. So YouTube, definitely something that we would push for and help John do if he wanted to work with us at some point. But point being, YouTube, you must be on YouTube. There is such a large audience for podcasts there. Then call to action. So here we typically like to look at, okay, what is it that John or the podcaster says to the audience to try and get engagement from them? Because by definition, podcast listeners are a passive audience, right? They are just hitting play and then doing laundry, folding, whatever, running errands, or even doing sports, right? People often do podcasts and something else at the same time. So what you want to do is try to engage this audience to get them to take action. So if you have a business, this is going to be, hey, don't forget that you can get more help from my services, go on my website, and so on and so forth. If you have sponsors, you are going to give a shout out to your sponsors in the hope that the listener is going to purchase from the sponsors, and so on and so forth. So we've already covered the business model from John, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But so point being, the call to action should probably be something around growing the podcast and, of course, promoting the sponsors because he's getting paid for that. So in the case of John, obviously there is a very good introduction of the podcast at the beginning. He is 4,000 plus episodes in. Obviously he nailed the art of introductions. Then he has a sponsored message at the start and the end, right? Which makes sense. And he also has call to actions to grow the podcast at the end. So what we call a call to action to grow the podcast is typically, hey, subscribe, follow, review, share with a friend, and so on and so forth. So he's doing this at the end, which is amazing. The only potential tweak that we would do here is to have a call to action at the beginning of the podcast as well to grow the podcast. Now, you cannot have too many call to actions right from the get-go, right? Otherwise, you are going to antagonize the audience, and this is definitely something that you do not want to do. Plus, John has reached a critical size where right now the podcast is only going to grow marginally, like not materially. So it's okay to focus on getting value from the podcast after building it for more than 12 years now. But if you're beginning in podcast, or if you're only a few years in, it could be super interesting to have that type of call to action, like, hey, if you enjoyed the episode, if you learned something today, please consider following the show, leaving a review, or subscribing to your favorite podcast platform, leaving us a 5-star review. This helps the podcast more than I could say. And if you find this valuable, others might, and this helps me put the podcast in front of more people. So would mean the world to me. Please go ahead. And that literally takes 5 seconds. It's not too pushy, not too salesy, and that usually gets very, very good results. Now, I want to pause here and talk about how to rank in the charts. So we use a tool called Pod Status, which allows us to track how a podcast is ranking over time. So in the case of John Lee Dumas, he's publishing an episode per day. Okay, so obviously he's getting lots and lots of downloads, and he is going from basically top 12 to top 40, maybe 50 in the careers category in Apple Podcasts charts. So pretty decent. Obviously you want to try and hit the top 10 because this is really what makes you stand out, but this is already a very, very good score. Now, how do you rank in the charts? So this is something that Apple and Spotify don't necessarily communicate too much around because they don't want people to try and cheat the system. But what we've noticed working and what Apple Podcasts also highlights is that subscribers, completion rate, so for how long people listen to the episode, is it 100%? Is it 50%? Do they drop after 10% of the episode? And number of downloads within a short period of time helps to rank a podcast and understand, okay, are people going to come to this podcast and stay there? Because the objective of the podcast platforms at the end of the day is to attract people and to get them to stay on the platform because this is how they are making money. So if a podcast is helping them do that, they will push that podcast. So subscription, completion rate, and number of downloads, those are the 3 main criteria. Ideally, if you can have many of those in a short period of time, like you do a big communication effort within 48 hours, for instance, this is going to increase highly your chances of ranking for the category that you're trying to rank for. Now, in the case of John, so this is a pretty solid chart. Honestly, he's doing a very good job at ranking in the careers category. Now, something that he probably didn't know or that his team doesn't know is that you can rank for a second category in Apple Podcasts. You can typically say, hey, my podcast is about careers and entrepreneurship typically, which is where we would expect to find entrepreneurs on fire. And the way I have to prove that is that one of our clients, Service Business Mastery, so those are all public data. I'm not revealing anything sensitive here. And if anything, that's pretty much praising something. So if we look at the Service Business Mastery podcast, we see that we made them rank for a very long period of time into 2 categories at the same time. So we switched them from marketing to management, but in the same time, we got them to rank for business. So business will be the second category, right? So obviously you're not typically looking at ranking as high in the second one than in the first one, but you increase discoverability like this in order to get more people to find out about your show. So that's something that you definitely might want to look into to, and for you, John, if you're watching this video, you want to get your podcast to rank in a second category, so that could be something interesting to achieve. Then, in terms of reviews, so something very interesting about John's podcast, and that's something we always pay attention to, is that he has almost 4,000 ratings on Apple Podcast for an average of 4.8, so that's absolutely fantastic. But on Spotify, he only has 30 reviews. So why do I think this is a problem? And I mark my words back to the thing of like, hey, multiplying by 3 the reach and views and downloads of John's. So YouTube is the first avenue for sure, but Spotify as well. So I would like to get your attention on this website, which is Buzzsprout Platform Statistics. So in case you don't know Buzzsprout, Buzzsprout is the second biggest and most used podcast hosting platform. So if you want to start a podcast, or if you have a podcast, you need to get it hosted on a website that is going to distribute it to all the podcast platforms where you can listen to podcasts. And so Spotify for Podcaster, Megaphone, Spreaker, Red Circle, Libsyn, Buzzsprout, those are podcast hosting platforms. Buzzsprout is the second biggest after Spotify for Podcaster. So a pretty important player in the industry. The good thing about Buzzsprout is that they report each and every month on the different metrics that the podcast hosted on their platform are getting. This is completely anonymized and aggregated, but it gives you a pretty good view of where the industry is at. And something that I want us to focus on right now is the number of downloads coming from Spotify versus the number of downloads coming from Apple Podcasts. And this isn't new. Honestly, I think it's since February 2024. Okay, so that's where Spotify took over. So normally in March 2024, okay, here it's proving me wrong, obviously. That's the choices of direct. Okay, so April 2024. And since then, it hasn't changed. Like since April 2024, Spotify is getting more downloads than Apple Podcasts. This is pretty new, right? Because it's less than a year and podcast has been around for a long time now. But as you can see, it is not changing. And depending on the month that you're looking at, Spotify is sometimes having more than 10% of the market more than Apple Podcasts. So we cannot overlook Spotify anymore. They are doing an amazing job for getting people to listen to podcasts on their platforms. And any podcasters who is not focusing their efforts on growing their audience on Spotify is missing out. So here I'm ready to bet that John has a vast majority of his downloads coming from Apple Podcast, whilst actually there is a bigger available audience on Spotify. So this is definitely something that we would look into. I'm just extrapolating here, right? If he has 3,800 people rating his show on Apple Podcasts and only 30 here, that's more than 100 times less. So there are less people listening to John's podcast on Spotify than Apple Podcasts. So how do you make this happen? Like getting more people to rate you on Spotify and to grow your audience on Spotify? Well, first and foremost, you need to optimize for discoverability, right? You want people to find your podcast organically. So this happens by optimizing the title for SEO, optimizing the show description. I'm not talking about the show notes yet, just the show description. So all these are things to look into. You can also rank for other categories in Spotify. So that's, again, something that I would do if I were John. And then this is also going to happen in the titles that you have and the show notes. But here he's doing a pretty decent job. So Spotify finds out that your podcast is actually getting traction, that people are listening to you on Spotify. So they push your podcast more and so on and so forth. Also, all the marketing efforts in general should be directed towards getting people to listen on Spotify rather than Apple Podcasts, because this is where you want to create momentum as the platform has a bigger audience than Apple Podcast. And this is still true for YouTube as well, by the way. So that's pretty much it for the call to action. Then we move on to the show notes, titles, and consistency section. So this is always a very interesting one for us, because this is not what's going to make like your podcast reach 10 times more people, right? But those are the small optimization that you can look into to definitely have a bigger impact. So show notes. Here the show notes, we have to bear in mind that the show notes are for two types of people. The first type of people are the ones who haven't listened to the episode yet, right? And want to find an episode about a certain topic. So if you make sure that your show notes are reflecting properly what's in the episode, Spotify and Apple Podcasts are going to propose it to people looking for certain keywords. Now, the search and discoverability of podcast platforms is not amazing, but it's still important to try and optimize for that. Then you want people to be able to quickly scan through what's in the episode before they click on play, right? You will have some people scrolling through your episodes and finding out about the one that is about creative passive income through real estate lean investing with Angela Duncan. And they will be like, interesting. So what is this episode about? Before clicking on play, they will look at the show notes. So it's super important here that the show notes are helping those people understand what's in the episode and make them want to listen to the episode. The second type of people that we are trying to optimize the show notes for are the people who have listened to the episode already and want to find out more about the podcaster, connect with the podcaster, or consult one of the guests or the resources mentioned in the episode. So you want to optimize the show notes for those two types of people. How do you do that? So honestly, John is already doing a pretty good job at this. Here is what I would change to make sure that the show notes are perfectly optimized for my podcast if Entrepreneurs on Fire was my podcast. So the first thing is, especially since we have a business behind it, I would have a call to action from the get-go. A call to action towards a free resource, like a free ebook, a free video series, a free podcast series, exclusive that you only get if you give your email address to strengthen the email list of the podcaster, right? Email lists are like just gold. Whether you're doing sponsorship or you have a business behind it or you're trying to generate leads, email list is paramount. So having a call to action towards a free resource that will give additional value to your audience is super interesting. Like, hey, download here a free ebook about how you can grow your podcast 3 times in 3 months. Let's say something like this. So that's the thing I would do, and I would embed the link, obviously, so people just have to click to get redirected towards the lead magnet. Then I would have a couple of lines paragraph around what's the episode about. So this is what John is doing here. It's one from the archives, which is interesting, but I would definitely look into this as well, making sure that we have 2-3 lines about the episode itself. Then I would have 2-3 lines about the speakers. So here John is doing this for the guests, which is absolutely fantastic. He's not talking about himself though. Here again, there might be a very good reason for that, is because if you go on John's podcast, you probably know who John is. But for the vast majority of podcasts, what we like to do is to give a quick excerpt of who the host is as well. Because if you're doing your job right, of growing the podcast, right, this is what happens. You have new people finding out about your podcast every day, starting with any episode. So you want them to be able to understand from the get-go who they are listening to and why you're legit to talk about what you're talking about. So here I would just potentially have 1 or 2 lines additional about John and who he is and why he is legit to talk about what he's talking about. Then, a bullet point list of what's in the episode. So that's kind of what they are doing here, top 3 value bombs. This is basically what they cover in the episode. What we like to do is to say, hey, in this episode, expect to learn. And here we put like 4 or 5 bullet points to highlight what's in the episode. If you can stick the timestamps as well, so people can navigate to it directly, that increases the chance of people taking action to listen to the episode. And then links. So this is already what John is doing here. But the interesting thing is that he's just proposing links towards his different sponsors, the guests company, HubSpot, which is the main sponsor, and then Thrive Time Show. But he is not actually proposing links towards his social medias. There is one around his website here, but like it lacks a bit of links to connect with John directly. And this is something that we like to do for podcasters, especially the ones trying to build a personal brand and generate leads, because if people want to connect with you, you must make it easy for them to connect with you where they want, which is why it's important to be present on the main 6 social media platforms. From the top of my head, that's LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter /X, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. You want to make it easy for people to find you on their favorite platform and to subscribe to your channel or to follow or to reach out to you directly. This is super, super important. So the only thing I would do here is like, hey, reach out to John, and here putting the different social media platforms. Worst case scenario, they go on your social media profile and they don't do anything. But if they give you a follow, that's also increasing brand on the different platforms. That's it about the show notes. And then 2 things that John is doing very, very well is consistency and titles. I'm still gonna say a few words around those for you who's watching this video and trying to get the most value out of it. So consistency, John is publishing every single day of the week, so you cannot do better. The only thing beyond that is 2 episodes a day, but that starts to be a lot of work. So when it comes to consistency, the important thing about podcasts is that you want to make it a habit for people to listen to you. You want to have them have the instinct of like, oh, it's Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. John is releasing a new episode, in the case he wasn't releasing every day. So making it easy for people to remember when to listen to you is super important. You cannot skip an episode, period. So you need to choose a day of the week, a time of the day where you're going to publish consistently your podcast episode. If that's twice a week, that's even better, but keep that consistency in. That's super, super important. And for the titles, so here, 90% of people will make a decision on whether to listen or not based on the title. The 10% remaining are the hardcore fans, but there are not that many hardcore fans per podcast. So you need to hook attention with a title. The very good way to hook attention or trigger curiosity or even better trigger emotions with a title is to have a hook, such as the secret of 7 reasons why, 5 ways to, here is why you. Those are hooks that you can add a valuable title afterwards, and that will make people have FOMO if they do not click. Then they click on download, and it's super important to deliver on that clickbait, right? It's not about just being clickbaity, it's also about telling the truth and delivering on that promise. If we look at the latest title from John, 6 biggest mistakes entrepreneurs make when buying businesses with Elliot Holland, an Entrepreneur of Fire Classic from 2021. So this is a very, very good title. Keyword rich, 6 biggest mistakes entrepreneurs make. So people are like, okay, there is a clear list of like 6 biggest mistakes. What are my 6 biggest mistakes? I want to listen to the episode. So title-wise, John is doing a very good job. Then moving on to the website. So here again, John is very much best in class when it comes to the website, but we're still going to have a look at it to understand a bit what's in there. So he has a good podcast section with each episode having their own page, and each episode page contains show notes, web player, exclusive timestamps, and SEO optimized content around the episode. We said well done here because this is really best in class. So let's look into it. If we look at the podcast section, first of all, you see some stats, which is very good, very engaging. You have here again a lead magnet, which is very recommended to have on the website to be able to capture people's email addresses and get them into an email nurture sequence so that you can transform them into clients if you have a business, or to sponsor buyers if you have sponsors. So lead magnet, that's amazing. I think he also has a pop-up that appears on the screen at some point. So that's really, really best in class. And here you have basically a page per episode. So that's very, very solid. You can listen to the episode directly on the website from the podcast section page. So this is very, very good. But the other thing that you can do is boom, click on the episode and have a dedicated episode page with here again, the call to action to subscribe to the different platforms. That's good. I wouldn't necessarily do that. I will explain why in a second, but that's not too bad. Guest resources, that's excellent. Value bombs, that's basically what was in the show notes. The different sponsors, this we've seen that. And then additional show notes to like navigate directly to certain timestamps, making it keyword rich as well. Something that I would potentially do if I were John was a real SEO optimized article, right? To drive engagement and attract that reading audience that is out there. He's making 5 episodes a week, so that's a lot of work and probably too many articles on the website. So I wouldn't necessarily look into this, but that's a possibility. And then he has the transcript as well on the website. So a few words about what we would do different and potentially on another podcast, but that could still be valuable for John's podcast. So the website is the most valuable asset of any podcasters, because if people go on your website and stay on your website, they can consume more of your content, find out more about you, so build trust with you, engage with you, find out more about your services if you have services, or find out more about your sponsors if you have sponsors. If you have the right lead gen tools in place, so a lead magnet on a pop-up, for instance, which we definitely recommend, you can also generate leads with it, if not clients directly, right? If you have like offers directly on the website that people can purchase, this is where the magic happens. Whoever you are, if you're in the podcast game, you want to have a website and to drive as many people as possible on the website and to get them to stay on, you got it, the website. So a few things to make that happen. The way John does it with the podcast section and the dedicated episode page for each and every episode is fantastic. What I would do differently though, first of all, I would have that pop-up. Like this, we get between 5 and 15% conversion on all our website traffics and anybody we implement this for, if we have a pop-up displaying an ebook that people want to listen to, right? Want to consume of, sorry. Back to the importance of like researching what is it that your audience is currently looking for and what are their pain points. So pop-up, super important. I think John has some, but maybe it's not displayed on the podcast section here. Second thing I would do, YouTube player and Spotify player. Why? So you want people to be able to watch and or listen to your podcast on your website so they stay there. But you want to use the YouTube player and the Spotify player for two reasons. First of all, this will give people not only the opportunity to consume your podcast on your website, but this will also count as a view or a download on those platforms. Big brain time. And there are obviously SEO optimization between YouTube and Google because it's the same company. So that's super important. Then I would have an SEO optimized article. Maybe not in the case of John, but for 99% of podcasters, I would do it. If you're releasing an episode every week or 2 episodes a week even, you can take the time to write a short article like 1,000, 1,500 words maximum about the episode. Because think about it. Podcast is growing and is getting bigger and bigger. But the reading audience's comparison is huge. You could, by transforming your audio content into written content, not only tap into this reading audience, but you would also get your website to rank higher for long-tail Google keywords about your topic, meaning more people going on your website, staying on your website, building trust with you, engaging with you, becoming a lead potentially, if not becoming a client. So SEO optimized article, huge believer in it. I would potentially do that. A quick word about transcript. So I understand John just has a system and a process in place here. Let me give you my 2 cents about transcripts. I think they are useless and they potentially harm your website. What do I mean by that? So you might be thinking, okay, the transcript is super keyword rich. So if I put it on my website, Google will understand that my website talks about this and people will potentially want to read my transcript. And so Google will send more traffic to my website and more people will come on my website. That's in theory. And that might have been true 20 years ago. Now, in the last 5 years, try to think about a moment where you searched something on Google and Google proposed you a transcript of a video or of a podcast. It probably never happened. And the reason is Google knows, if anything, we can trust Google about that. Google knows that nobody reads transcript, which is why they are not proposing transcript results for searches about any topic, because nobody reads a transcript. This is not digestible, right? You don't want to consume a 30-minute conversation in writing. You want a summarized article at worst, or the video or the episode directly at best. But you do not want to consume a transcript. Google knows that and is not sending any traffic to those websites. So the thing is, it's very keyword rich, and 20 years ago, the way people were optimizing for SEO was to have like a lot of keywords on their website. And back then, you didn't have many options, so transcript could do the job. But this is not the case anymore. And if anything, the keywords on this transcript might be cannibalizing other pages on John's podcast website, meaning they are competing for the same keyword, and therefore Google is like downgrading both of them instead of pushing one more. So transcript, I wouldn't do that if I were John. And if you're watching this right now and you were thinking, or you are doing transcript right now on your website, don't. This is not doing any good. Moving on to the social media section. So this is where the fun begins. So we are huge believers into repurposing the podcast content into social media clips, LinkedIn posts, Twitter tweets, or X. Like this is just free, right? You have a podcast episode that you can repurpose into so many pieces of content. We, at minimum, create 21 pieces of content out of one episode. And this for any client that we have. This is the minimum we do. So think about one episode, which is an audio episode, a video episode, an article, and 18 pieces of content. How do we do that? So we extract 3 snippets of less than 30 seconds from each and every episode that we transform into Instagram Reels, Facebook Reels, Twitter tweets, LinkedIn posts, TikTok video, and YouTube Shorts. Times 3, that's 18 pieces of content. If you have a weekly episode, that's on top of the episode and the article, 21 pieces of content. This is just, podcast is a content machine. Now, a few words about clips from podcast episodes, because we know that a lot of people have tried, a lot of people are thinking about it, but not many people are getting results from that. You are not going to get a significant increase in your downloads if you do social media clips, period. Because even if your shorts are performing very well, guess what people consuming shorts want more of? That's right, shorts. So at best, they will subscribe to your channel where they consume that and will get back to get more shorts. But they will very rarely go from the YouTube short or Instagram Reels or Facebook Reels or TikTok channel onto the podcast. It can happen, but that's going to be very marginal. So that's the first thing. Like, don't count on massive social media marketing to get more downloads on your podcast. Now, it's still super important to do it because you want to create that ecosystem around the podcast. It's super, super important because you want to grow a brand on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube Short for multiple reasons. First one is you want to get an as big audience as possible, whatever the objective of the podcast is. And the second thing is people, after repetition, might be indeed coming to YouTube for a long form video or to the podcast directly for episodes. So you want to have that. Plus, it's very good for sponsorship negotiations and also to grow a lead gen system if you have a business behind the podcast. So whatever the scenario, you want to extract snippets out of your episodes to put on social media. You want to tailor the caption, you want to work on the hook, even if that means you need to record a hook separately or you need to take a hook from the video itself and put it at the beginning. That's how you get views. And this is actually a very important point. How to get views from podcast shorts, because we see so many people doing it but getting barely a few dozen views. So this is happening because he is not doing short form content the right way, which is okay. He's definitely, again, he's having a very successful podcast, not putting that into question. But the thing is, if you want short form content that performs, you need to really select the best snippets possible. So the ones that are relevant to your audience, back to the content part of things. You also want to select ideally something controversial or something that is a bit energetic or where you have emotions, because this is what performs on short form. Then you need to put the right hook at the beginning and you need to put subtitles that he is doing. And you need to market this. And then it's good to get views, but what you want is business, if you have a business behind it, or more sponsorship and bigger sponsorship deals. So you need to redirect all those views towards wherever you want this audience to go. So in the case of a business, you want to redirect them towards your lead magnets. If you have sponsors, you want to redirect as many as possible towards your sponsor page or a podcast episode or a YouTube page or a landing page to get them to subscribe to your email list so that you can communicate about the episodes going live. So this is the short form media game, and this is how you should be considering short form content from your podcast. So in the case of John, what's super, super intriguing is that on LinkedIn, regardless of his official podcast page, although he has 2,000 followers, or his personal page, he's barely communicating about the podcast. Like the last post is from 3 months ago. He's recording an episode a day. There is for sure ways to extract good shorts and publish them on LinkedIn. Now, back to the video aspect of it. It's probably not happening because he's not recording with video nor publishing it, or he's probably recording with video but not treating it as is, and he's just focusing on the audio format. So video, I would definitely look into this if I were him. So that's for LinkedIn. Facebook, he is publishing, that's what's very interesting is that he's publishing the full episode on Facebook with a little excerpt. But again, we see that people are not going on Facebook to just listen to a podcast, right? This is not the right platform for this. What you want to do on Facebook is to have crafted, tailored snippets or even static images from the podcast and redirect people towards somewhere. Because we see that despite the fact that he has almost 5,000 friends, he's not getting any traction on Facebook. So here again, a potential area of opportunities. When we look at Instagram, so for Instagram, here again, what's very interesting is that he is publishing some shorts actually with a bit of text, but we see that he's not getting any views except for this one. Very interesting. Those two are getting some views. Maybe he put some ad budget behind it. Let's have a look quickly. Here we go. So this is how we analyze a podcast. Let's have a look at it. So there is 0 likes. There is 0 likes and 0 comments, but yet there is 22,000 views. So here, my suspicion is that there is some ad budget behind it. Clearly, it's all around the 23,000 mark. So there is some ad budget behind it. He probably didn't get any positive impact from this for his business, nor the sponsor. So that's why he stopped. And the latest one have just a few hundred views. So here again, back to the importance of having video. Like if you want to do short form content, you need to have a facial expression. You need to have a person's face. That's what people will stop on. If they just scroll and see this type of content, they will not stop. And this is what's happening, unfortunately. YouTube Shorts, we already covered it, so same thing here. The interesting thing about John's podcast is that he's not present on Twitter. Actually, we made this research. There is somebody called John Lee Dumas, but then we understand that it's Mary Catherine Johnson, kind of impersonating John Lee Dumas, or at least having the name here, talking to entrepreneurs. That's clearly her niche. So that's interesting. Definitely not John. So he's not doing anything on Twitter/X. You're not going to get massive traction for your podcast on Twitter/X. And last but not least, TikTok. So here, again, John is not present. So whether we look for Entrepreneurs on Fire or John Lee Dumas, some people tag him, some people mention that they've talked to John Lee Dumas and advertise it on TikTok, but John himself doesn't have a channel on TikTok. Here again, in my opinion, huge opportunity for John because there is just so much to be done around TikTok. It's a growing platform. There is like tons and tons of users there. Again, you're not going to get massive amount of download increase if you go on TikTok, but you can for sure build an audience on TikTok. And the number of people who are actually discovering about podcasters and consuming their content again and again and again on TikTok is absolutely crazy. So if you have the opportunity, if you're recording with video, and if you can, do publish on TikTok. That is worthwhile. And that is pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it insightful. We really went in depth on all the aspects of John's podcast. John, love you. You're doing an amazing job. Obviously, you have a very sound and solid business model. The whole idea here was more to say, hey, is there something that we would potentially do differently or where we see a big opportunity? If you liked this video, if you would like to get your podcast analyzed, I'm going to put a link in the description. You can just opt in. That's the email so we can send you the analysis and the name of your podcast so we can do the analysis. It's completely free. Just send us the request and we will send it to you in a similar format as this one. Cheers.